You'll be absolutely stunned by this revelation. When someone exhibits this particular behavior around others, they're exposing their most buried secrets, and Freud understood it completely. Have you ever witnessed how certain individuals completely transform their personality the moment they find themselves in a group setting? One moment, they appear timid and withdrawn. The next instant, they're commanding conversations with an almost aggressive intensity. Or perhaps someone you know intimately suddenly becomes distant and cold whenever strangers enter the room. Picture this scenario. You're at a dinner gathering with close friends, and the person sitting beside you, who privately displays sweetness and vulnerability, suddenly starts making cutting, sarcastic remarks and criticizing other guests. What's really happening beneath the surface? According to Sigmund Freud's analysis, these behavioral patterns aren't random occurrences. They represent transparent windows into our unconscious mind, involuntary revelations of our deepest internal conflicts and the defense mechanisms we automatically activate to shield ourselves from social anxiety. What you're about to discover today transcends mere behavioral analysis of human nature. It's essentially a comprehensive map for decoding the hidden signals we all unconsciously broadcast. Freud taught us that nothing ever appears exactly as it seems on the surface level. Every gesture, every spoken word, every behavioral shift in the presence of others reveals something profound about who we truly are at our core. If you're interested in continuing to explore the mysteries of human behavior, subscribe to the channel. The first signal we're about to uncover will leave you completely speechless. Recognize this immediately. When someone transforms into an entirely different person around others, they're not simply adapting to social contexts. They're revealing a deep fracture within their psychological structure. Imagine your partner, typically calm and thoughtful, suddenly becoming the absolute center of attention at a party, telling jokes, playing the entertainer, constantly seeking approval from others through exaggerated gestures and humor. This behavior doesn't emerge from nowhere. According to Freud's analysis, it represents what he termed reaction formation, a defense mechanism where the unconscious transforms an unacceptable impulse into its complete opposite. The shy individual who becomes hyperactive in public settings is likely compensating for deep feelings of inadequacy. Freud would explain this phenomenon through his theory of wounded narcissism. During childhood, this person probably experienced episodes of humiliation or rejection that created a narcissistic injury. To protect against the pain of feeling not enough, the unconscious developed a strategy, becoming irresistible in the eyes of others. But there's much more to uncover. This social transformation also reveals what Freud called the return of the repressed. Childhood traumas, buried deep in the unconscious, resurface in the form of compulsive behaviors. The person desperately seeking attention in public is unconsciously attempting to rewrite their childhood narrative, where they perhaps felt invisible or unloved. The mechanism operates subtly yet powerfully. The conscious ego believes it's simply socializing, but the unconscious is staging a much deeper drama. It's the symbolic performance of a wounded child screaming, "See me, love me, don't abandon me." This dynamic explains why many people feel emotionally drained after intense social events. It's not merely physical exhaustion, it's the depletion that comes from maintaining a mask that contradicts their true nature. The psychic energy required to sustain this performance is enormous because the unconscious knows it's living a lie. Freud taught us that every symptom carries meaning. The social chameleon isn't a personality trait. It's a symptom of an unresolved conflict between the desire to be accepted and the fear of being rejected for who we actually are. Have you ever observed this pattern in yourself or someone close to you? Next time you witness such a drastic social transformation, remember, you're watching the unconscious in action. But this is only the beginning. In our next chapter, we'll discover how seemingly random aggression in public reveals something even more disturbing about our suppressed impulses. Don't ignore this signal. The person who becomes subtly aggressive only when witnesses are present is revealing one of the most complex and dangerous psychological mechanisms of the human unconscious. Picture yourself in a work meeting. A colleague, normally friendly in one-on-one interactions, begins making cutting comments, sarcastic jokes that wound, or criticizing others' ideas with a false smile plastered on their face. This isn't baseless malice. It's what Freud called displacement, where the unconscious releases suppressed anger onto safe targets. According to Freudian psychoanalysis, this dynamic emerges from what he defined as conflict between the id and superego. Adi, the id, the most primitive part of our psyche, overflows with aggressive and destructive impulses that the superego, our moral conscience, judges as completely unacceptable. But this energy cannot simply be eliminated. It must find an outlet. The presence of other people provides the unconscious justification to release this suppressed aggression. The mechanism functions like this. The unconscious perceives the social group as a pack where hierarchies and competitive struggles exist. In this context, aggression can be disguised as critical thinking or sharp humor, but the true origin of this behavior runs much deeper. Freud identified in the anal phase of psychosexual development the origins of many controlling and passive-aggressive behaviors. If a person experienced intense conflicts related to control during childhood, whether from overly strict or overly permissive parents, the unconscious might have developed a compulsive need to dominate others through criticism and subtle humiliation. The social group thus becomes the perfect theater for this unconscious performance. The person can feel powerful and in control while seemingly maintaining socially acceptable behavior. It's a form of psychological sadism masquerading as social normalcy. There's an even more disturbing element. This selective aggression often reveals the presence of what Freud called penis envy, or more generally, primitive envy. Not necessarily gender-related, but the unconscious need to destroy what one cannot possess. The person attacking others in public often projects their envy onto qualities they perceive as superior in others. The projection mechanism is fundamental here. Instead of recognizing their own inadequacy, the unconscious projects it onto others, transforming inner pain into external aggression. It's not that I'm wrong, it's that others are stupid, incompetent, ridiculous. This explains why many people feel uncomfortable in the presence of these quiet aggressors. On an unconscious level, we perceive the hidden violence behind their smiles and seemingly harmless jokes. Have you ever sensed this negative energy in someone who appeared completely normal on the surface? The next chapter will reveal how the desperate need for approval hides something even deeper about our psychological structure. This behavior becomes impossible to ignore once you learn to recognize it. The person constantly seeking validation and approval from others isn't simply being sociable. They're revealing an emotional hunger that Freud directly connected to the first months of life. Imagine you're at a dinner with friends. One person constantly asks, "Did you like what I said? Do you think I did it right? What do you think about me?" Or they constantly tell stories about their successes, expecting compliments, or continuously put themselves down, seeking reassurance. This behavioral pattern isn't random. It's the manifestation of what Freud called oral fixation. And according to psychoanalytic theory, during the first months of life, we develop our fundamental relationship with satisfaction through feeding and contact with our mother. When this phase is experienced with frustration through abandonment, rejection, or inadequate care, the unconscious becomes stuck in an endless search for emotional nourishment. The person begging for approval is unconsciously seeking to fill a void that formed during the oral developmental phase. Every compliment, every validation, every approving glance becomes symbolically mother's milk, a source of psychological nutrition meant to fill the emotional hole from childhood. But here's the paradox Freud intuited. The more approval this person receives, the more they need. It's like trying to fill a bucket with holes. The emotional energy received from others immediately slips away because the problem isn't the quantity of love received in the present, but the quality of love not received in the past. This mechanism also reveals the presence of what Freud called pathological narcissism. Not the healthy narcissism that allows us self-esteem, but the wounded kind that constantly needs external validation to survive. The unconscious has learned that love is conditional, received only when one is good enough, and has developed a survival strategy based on continuous performance. The dynamic becomes even more complex when we understand that this hunger for approval often hides its opposite: deep anger toward parental figures who couldn't provide the unconditional love the child needed. But this anger is too threatening for the conscious ego, so it gets transformed through reaction formation into emotional dependency. There's a tragic aspect to all this. The person desperately seeking approval unconsciously often repels exactly the people who could give them the authentic love they need. Why? Because free and unconditional love threatens the psychological structure they've built for survival. If someone loves them as they are, it means their entire performance strategy was useless. Freud taught us that symptoms always serve a purpose. The approval seeker has developed a survival strategy that, however painful, at least guarantees them a minimum of emotional nourishment in a world they've learned to perceive as indifferent. Have you ever recognized this hunger in yourself? In the next chapter, we'll discover how obsessive control of others hides one of mankind's most primitive fears. Recognize this pattern immediately. The person who subtly seeks to control others' behaviors, conversations, and decisions when you're in public isn't exercising leadership. They're revealing one of the most primitive and destructive fears of the human unconscious. Picture yourself at a party. Someone begins constantly interrupting conversations to redirect them, decides where everyone should sit, critiques others' choices, or makes comments that subtly manipulate the group's mood. This behavior doesn't arise from personal security. It's the manifestation of what Freud called castration anxiety, which in broader terms represents the terrible fear of being annihilated, abandoned, or completely losing control over one's existence. According to Freudian psychoanalysis, this mechanism has roots in the phallic developmental phase, when the child discovers they're not the absolute center of the universe and that forces exist more powerful than themselves. When this phase is poorly processed, often through overprotective or over-controlling parents, the unconscious develops a defense strategy. If I control everything happening around me, I cannot be hurt or abandoned. The obsessive control of others is therefore a projection mechanism. Instead of facing their own inner vulnerability, the person attempts to manage the external environment. It's as if the unconscious thinks, if I can control others' reactions, I can also control my pain. But there's an even deeper dynamic Freud identified. This behavior often reveals the presence of suppressed sadistic impulses. The person controlling others unconsciously satisfies the need for dominance and submission that stems from unresolved conflicts of the anal phase. The psychological pleasure they feel watching others submit to their manipulations is a form of sublimated sexual satisfaction. This explains why the hidden controller often chooses weaker or more insecure people as targets. The unconscious instinctively knows on whom it can exercise its power without risking too strong a reaction. It's a form of psychological bullying disguised as care or social organization. The dynamic becomes pathological when we understand that this control never actually reduces the underlying anxiety. On the contrary, every successful act of control feeds the unconscious paranoia that without their constant vigilance, everything would collapse. It's a vicious cycle where the more you control, the more you need to control. Freud also connected this behavior to the concept of infantile omnipotence, the unconscious fantasy of being an omnipotent parental figure who can protect everyone from the terrors of the world. But this fantasy hides its opposite. the terror of being the helpless child who needs protection. There's a particularly insidious aspect to this mechanism. The hidden controller often manages to convince even themselves that they're acting for others' good. This self-deception is possible thanks to what Freud called rationalization, where the unconscious provides the conscious ego with logical and morally acceptable explanations for behaviors that stem from much less noble impulses. The truth is that this person has such deep fear of abandonment and annihilation that they'd rather destroy the spontaneity and authenticity of relationships than risk feeling vulnerable. Have you ever suffered this kind of subtle control, or ever recognized yourself in the controller's role? The next chapter will show you how strategic isolation of others reveals even darker impulses of the human soul. Never underestimate this signal. The person who systematically tries to isolate others from their bonds when you're in social contexts isn't protecting anyone. They're executing one of the most destructive mechanisms Freud ever identified in the human unconscious. Picture this scene. You're at dinner with your partner and some friends. One person in the group begins subtly sowing doubts, making comments that create tension between present couples, telling stories that cast absent people in a bad light, or suggesting that certain bonds are unhealthy. This behavior isn't random. It's the manifestation of what Freud called the death drive, thanatos, the unconscious impulse toward destruction and return to original chaos. According to psychoanalytic theory, every human carries two fundamental forces: eros, the life drive that creates and builds bonds, and thanatos, the death drive that destroys and dissolves. The strategic isolator is dominated by the second. Their unconscious feels deep and primitive pleasure watching others' bonds dissolve. But why does this destructive impulse manifest specifically through isolation? Freud explained this phenomenon through the concept of primary envy. The strategic isolator, often deprived of secure and stable bonds in their own childhood, has developed unconscious hatred against all bonds they see in others. If I cannot have love, no one should have it. This mechanism is particularly insidious because it often disguises itself as genuine concern. The isolator says things like, "Don't you think your partner is too possessive? Your friends don't seem sincere to me. That person isn't worthy of you." Deal. The superego manages to morally justify these destructive interventions by presenting them as protective acts of love. But the unconscious dynamic is much darker. According to Freud, this behavior often reveals the presence of what he called unresolved Oedipus complex. The strategic isolator unconsciously attempts to destroy all symbolic marriages around them because their unconscious is still blocked in the infantile desire to exclusively possess the love object and annihilate all rivals. There's an even more disturbing aspect. The strategic isolator often chooses people as targets who are in happy and stable relationships. Why? Because others' happiness threatens their defensive psychological construction. If others can be happy in relationships, it means their pessimism about love's possibility might be wrong, and that would question their entire identity. The projection mechanism is central here. The isolator projects onto others' bonds all their unresolved conflicts, fears, experiences of betrayal and abandonment. They cannot see others' love for what it is, but only through the filter of their personal pain. Freud also identified a masked, sadistic component in this behavior. The isolator unconsciously feels pleasure seeing the suffering their revelations and advice cause in others. It's a form of revenge against love itself, which disappointed them so deeply in the past. The tragedy is that this behavior is often self-perpetuating. The more the isolator destroys bonds around them, the more they confirm their conviction that love is impossible, further feeding their destructive impulse. Have you ever met someone who systematically undermines others' bond? The final chapter will reveal the most subtle and dangerous signal of all, the one that betrays the presence of impulses that not even the person themselves can recognize. This is the most dangerous signal of all, precisely because it's the hardest to recognize. The person who exercises subtle and constant seduction on everyone around them, regardless of their relationship status, isn't simply socializing. They're revealing what Freud considered one of the most destructive and primitive mechanisms of the human unconscious. Imagine you're at an evening with friends. There's someone who systematically seeks prolonged eye contact with everyone, makes ambiguous compliments, uses invasive body language, accidentally touches people, or makes jokes with double meanings, all while seemingly maintaining socially acceptable behavior. This isn't natural charm. It's what Freud called malignant narcissism, the compulsive need to psychologically possess every person who enters their field of vision. According to Freudian psychoanalysis, this behavior emerges from a lethal combination of drives originating in the most primitive developmental phases. The invisible seducer is blocked in what Freud called the primary oral stage, where the only way to relate to the world was through incorporation, literally eating everything they desired. But there's an even darker dynamic. This need to seduce everyone doesn't arise from love for others, but from hatred of themselves. The invisible seducer has developed a psychological structure where the only way to feel alive is through constant confirmation of their attractiveness. Each person who falls into their net temporarily becomes proof of their worth, but this feeling lasts very briefly and must be continuously renewed. Freud connected this mechanism to the concept of repetition compulsion. The unconscious is forced to repeat the same pattern infinitely to resolve an original trauma it cannot process. The invisible seducer is probably reliving an infantile dynamic where parental love was tied to their ability to be irresistible. Thus, the truly disturbing element is that this behavior hides destructive impulses disguised as attraction. The seducer doesn't really want to build relationships. They want to prove to themselves that they can destroy others. Every time they generate even a moment of tension or attraction in a committed person, they symbolically kill that relationship's stability. This connects to what Freud called active castration complex. Instead of suffering castration symbolically from more powerful figures, the seducer identifies with the aggressor and tries to psychologically castrate others by depriving them of security in their bond. The splitting mechanism is fundamental here. The seducer divides every person into conquerable and non-conquerable, but in reality, every human becomes merely an object for satisfying their wounded ego. They don't see people as individuals with feelings and their own relationships, but as narcissistic extensions of themselves. There's a particularly sadistic aspect to all this. The invisible seducer often feels the greatest pleasure not when they conquer someone, but when they see the confusion and guilt their seduction creates in the victim. It's a form of emotional vampirism, where they feed off others' discomfort. Freud had intuited that this personality type often hides deep identification with seductive or inappropriate parental figures who taught the child that love is obtained through sexual manipulation rather than emotional authenticity. The final tragedy is that the invisible seducer is condemned to eternal loneliness. The more they perfect their ability to seduce, the further they distance themselves from the possibility of authentic love, because they've completely lost the ability to see the other as a real person. Have you ever sensed this predatory energy disguised as charm? Now that you know all these signals, you'll no longer be able to ignore what others' unconscious reveals to you. Freud had warned us, nothing we do in front of others is random. Every social behavior is a theatrical performance of the unconscious, where our deepest traumas desperately seek a solution that often never comes. But here's the question I leave you with. Now that you know these signals, what will you do when you recognize them in yourself? If this journey into the unconscious has moved you, write your hometown in the comments. I want to know where this community of human psyche explorers comes from. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more revelations about the secrets of the human mind. Share this video with those you think might need these truths. Thank you for having the courage to look with me into the abysses of the human soul. We'll see each other on the next journey into the depths of the unconscious. What city are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know.